I'm Runde. I'm the Schreier Chair here at CSIS, and I'm participating in a Blogging Heads interview with Nitin Pai. Nitin?
Hi, I'm Nitin Pai, the fellow and the founder for geopolitics at the Takshashila institution, a network think tank based out of India.
Well, it's great to talk with you. Nitin, I suspect the reason that you all were kind enough to ask me to participate in this is that I recently blogged about my trip to India. I'm doing a project looking at middle-income countries, how the United States ought to rethink its relationship with a number of middle-income countries, that we have a legacy set of development interests, or looking at, we partially look at some of the middle-income countries like India, Russia, and Brazil as developing countries, and they certainly are developing countries. But I argue in my work, and I'll be coming out with a report in the next several weeks, that we actually have a broader set of development interests, and that we're not set up as a government in the United States to take full advantage of these cooperation interests, is what I call them, that are broader around trade or science or helping other developing countries or solving broader strategic issues, either in the neighborhood where a particular country is, such as India, or farther afield. But I suspect my blog post about my trip to India in that context is what prompted the reason for our meeting virtually today.
Yeah, Dan, I think it was, I read the blog post almost as soon as it came out. And what I liked about it is that it sort of comprehensively put together various bullet points which are sort of overlooked in the strategic commentary, right? Because what happens is most of the strategic commentary revolves around present day and short term and the medium term kind of issues on which there are differing positions and a lot of question marks. So comprehensively listing the whole gamut of issues where the cooperation capital is much higher than competition is just one of the few things which should have been straightforward to a lot of people, but it's good to see you do that. Now, you see, the whole argument which many of us have been making in India over the last 2 decades is that there is a broad congruence of interests and a convergence of interest between India and the United States, if you look at it on broad geopolitical terms, on a large canvas, 21st century, and so forth. And it's almost unimaginable that there will be divergences on that scale. However, there have always been showstoppers in the short and the medium term, which sort of took the focus away from the larger and the broader issues. So it's good to see an effort being done to bring everything onto the table and have a not necessarily a rosy and an optimistic view, but a realistic view of where the cooperation can be.
No, thanks, Nitin. I really appreciate that. I do think you're right. There have been any number of showstoppers, and I think certainly there's the Indian relationship with Pakistan, which I think absorbs a lot of energy and time and focus here in Washington. Certainly, the conversation related to Pakistan on the conversation with Afghanistan. When I was in the Delhi airport, it was clear to me that for many Afghans, a second home is India, and there were many Afghans at the airport, and it's something that people aren't aware of, is that there's a strong Indian tie with various parts of Afghan society, which I know you're very well aware of. And then I also think it's within the relation of the India-China relationship is also something that gets a lot of oxygen in the conversation. And finally, the role that India might play vis-a-vis Iran is something that also takes gets a lot of time and attention as well. So
yeah. What
happens is that here in Washington, those are the 3 or 4 topics that absorb 80 or 90% of the oxygen. What I was hoping to do with that blog post, and I think with the report that we'll come out with in a few weeks here at CSIS, is that there are a number of significantly important issues to India that don't fall into those 4 buckets, if you will, that also have shared interests with us around sharing prosperity and sort of a more stable world. But at the same time, we're set up, the way in which we engage with India is is sort of with a series of legacy instruments and resourcing to focus on, frankly, social service delivery in a number of the poorer states in India, where I frankly think that India is in a place where, given that it's a G20 member, has an emerging space exploration program, has an emerging foreign assistance program, that it's going to become much more difficult in the United States to sell, if you'll allow me to use the word sell, a traditional social service foreign assistance program in the way that we envisioned these in the 1960s, and to some extent have carried through with some evolution and change over time. But in a place like India, I think it's going to be particularly difficult as here in the U.S. as we make difficult choices about our limited foreign assistance budget. Middle-income countries are going to be the path of least political resistance.
That's right.
But at the same time, I think, as I say in that blog, and I'd love to talk to you about what these interests are, for much smaller amounts of money strategically spent, oftentimes cost-shared with the Indian government or other Indian stakeholders, or to be used as catalytic funding for something that can be left in the hands of Indian players, we could get a lot more bang for our buck with a much smaller amount of money and focus on a number of sectors that are, frankly, of greater strategic interest to India. Certainly there's human suffering in India, and I know that there are more poor people in India than all of sub-Saharan Africa, which shocked me when I heard that. But at the same time, you've got you've got sustained growth rates even through the crisis. You have an emerged middle class. India is an exporter of culture through Bollywood. It's an amazing society. And for those of you that haven't been to India, I strongly recommend it. It renews my faith in capitalism, it renews my faith in globalization, even with the challenges of globalization, and even with some of the challenges, perhaps at times, of capitalism.
Yeah.
India is an example of, over the last 20 years of making significant strides, and has reduced poverty by hundreds of millions of people because of the reforms that the current Prime Minister made as finance minister.
Yeah, what I want to bring out there is that the issue of poverty in India and development in India I think has been miscast over the last 10 to 15 years. The government of India has a lot of money, in the sense
Absolutely.
that much of there was this debate over the aid which the UK seems to be giving India, and it befuddles my mind. Why exactly is the United Kingdom or some third-party country still giving aid to India? Because it doesn't make sense. Because the government of India is pouring money into big spending schemes, very, very inefficiently designed, very poorly implemented, and designed in a way as to be poorly implemented. So one of the best things the external world can do is to stop, pouring money into the Indian treasury, directly or indirectly, and compel the Indian government to spend less, and spend whatever it does more efficiently in a more targeted way. Now, what is interesting here is what the United States and India can do in terms of taking a common set of values with financial and other resources coming from the United States, some amount of financial resources coming from India, and take it to third countries in and around the region, where there is really a shortfall of budgetary resources. Now, one of the interesting things, and the story which you might have heard about, is the difference in the Indian and the Chinese way of approaching Africa. Right? There's been a lot of resistance and controversy regarding how the Chinese have a top-down approach to Africa, where they bring in their own thousands of their own low-skilled and skilled labor into African countries and distort the local labor markets and local societies, causing political and other problems. In sharp contrast to that, the Indian approach has been bottom-up, entrepreneurial, in congruence with the economics and the politics of local societies in African countries. So there is a far more acceptance of the Indian model of engagement, leading to outcomes which both in a way in India and the United States would be proud of. Democracy, empowering local communities, and therefore creating what I would call grassroots foundations for liberal democracy in third countries. Now, the challenges for the United States to do that is because there is a legacy. There's a Cold War legacy. The U.S. has backed certain regimes. There's also a reputational issue because the U.S. has been seen as a neo-colonialist, imperialist power. I mean, we might not agree with that characterization, but such an impression obtains in many parts of the world. Now, if you were to reimagine an international partnership where India and the United States could cooperate. Now, this is easier said than done because he that has the gold makes the rules, and so you would have a lot more. You would have a lot of pressure from the United States and the U.S. government to do things the way the U.S. does it, right? But the challenge here is that the way the U.S. does it has not been. There are places where I would admit it's been done very well, right? I mean, I'm not one of those who would say that the U.S. pattern of international development is entirely wrong, but there are places.
Let me respond.
Yeah,
this is great, Nitin. Let me respond to three things and unpack it because I think you've got a number of rich things that you've put on the table. So, a couple things. It's in 2003, I believe, India basically kicked out most of the traditional European donors, the usual suspects, except for 6. Including the UK, the World Bank, and the United States. The UK, its largest donor program is in India, partially, I think, for colonial legacy reasons, and partially a mix of interest reasons.
Or maybe bureaucratic inertia. Yeah.
And then, though I think you're aware that I think it's the current Indian finance minister just recently said, we don't need your aid, and I think I probably wouldn't have put it that way. So indelicately.
That was put very insensitively because it is still the British taxpayers' money which has been given for a good cause.
That's right.
I think he could have put it more sensitively.
And even worse than that, Nitin, is the issue of the UK, the DFID minister, Andrew Mitchell, basically fought and bled politically to keep the India program about 6 or 12 months ago. This was a big issue in the UK. And so for the Indian finance minister to say this is going to greatly complicate the UK government in the future. So on the one hand, on the one topic on that. Let me just touch on the U.S. and as a donor, and let me get to sort of third countries because I think you've put a number of interesting issues on the table. Certainly in the case of some of the institutes of technology in India, the United States, as you'll recall, helped set up at least one of them and maybe perhaps several of them. And I think that's actually one of the great successes of American foreign assistance that people don't know. There are a lot of did-you-know moments about assistance, and that's certainly one of them. I think it's gone off and trained many of the folks who've gone and become leaders in technology in India and globally, including in Silicon Valley. And that's come back to pay dividends in many, many ways. In addition, as you well know, Norman Borlaug is a revered figure in India who is the winner of the Nobel Peace Prize and was the father of the Green Revolution, which was a significant movement in the 60s to use research to improve agricultural productivity in South Asia and saved hundreds of millions of lives. And as you know, Nitin, Norman Borlaug is a very well-known figure in India and almost forgotten here in the United States, except for those who are in the development community or in the agriculture communities. And so there are some examples of success even in India. And it leads to the issue that you were talking about, which is how could we cooperate together? Because I do think that's one of the questions on the table and one of the things that we should be thinking about with middle-income countries like India is where and how we can work together. And I listed several. I think one is, I agree with you that India has a different approach to development. You've just set up in the foreign ministry in India, the Indian foreign ministry has just set up its own official aid agency. I met with the first official employee of the Indian aid agency a couple weeks ago. India has been doing foreign assistance even without setting up a bureaucratic institution to do it for a long time in various ways. They've had what you would call in the development business South-South cooperation for many, many years. And this is sort of taking it to the next level. I agree with you. I also think what's great about India is it's what's known as frugal innovation. Because there's so much rural poverty and because of the ubiquitousness of technology, there have been any number of different solutions that have been developed in India for the Indian context that are now exportable to developing countries. And I would give the United States credit and the Obama administration credit on the issue of on the issue of they've just launched a new innovation fund with an Indian Chamber of Commerce, in which they're hoping to catalyze another $40 million of Indian private sector money to look at both nonprofit and for-profit innovative models to help solve problems that are associated with poverty. It could be things like base of the pyramid business models, which you're familiar with, Nitin, of course, and to bring them to Africa. So there's this new innovation fund that have been set up, and I think that is a good start.
You see, I frankly, just to stop you here for a moment, the two models which you proposed, which you mentioned, the IITs and Norman Borlaug's the Green Revolution, actually tell you exactly what works. Right? What works is not billions of dollars of money into some big spending scheme. What works is actually building human capital, because both of those built human capital in slightly different ways. The IITs directly, and Green Revolution in an indirect way,
bringing technology to people who are able to human capital and expertise,
and bring it down to that level of the farmer and the local communities who could use that technology. I mean, if you look at agricultural advances as technology. Now, that is a kind of model which doesn't require lots of money. $40 million, $100 million is the kind of ballpark of the size of a fund which you need. Not billions, but tens to hundreds of millions, which can actually go a long way if employed thoughtfully and exploiting the amount of knowledge which has come out. One of the good things is, thanks to the internet and other things, there's been an explosion in the kind of development knowledge which comes down from the ground. In other words, we are able to celebrate those bottom-up models, like the solar. There's a factory and a school in rural Rajasthan which actually makes solar technology. Right? We wouldn't have known about this at an international level 20 years ago, because simply there was no way to gather that information. And the second is that this information, this technology can diffuse downwards because of the same mechanisms. And one of the interesting things is this. There are about 800 to 900 million cell phones in India. Literally, you're poor, rich, in the cities or villages, you have access to a mobile phone. And this is happening across the world. So in other words, to get a piece of information down to these people, whether they are in India, whether they are in other parts of the world, is very, very easy. So knowledge plus information technology through these global communications networks, we're sitting on a threshold of an immense opportunity. Unfortunately, what happens is this idea that there is an opportunity gets drowned because it's not consistent with the kind of development models which development specialists are
wedded to.
Yeah, and also because you have traditional schemes which involve building huge amounts of building big buildings or diverting flows of rivers and so on and so forth, which sort of suddenly look at this small little project and say, no, we are spending billions of dollars on this major project. Why is this small little thing going to help us any more than this big project?
Nitin, you've prompted a thought, and I'm also cognizant of the time, and you've been very generous. So let me close with a couple thoughts, because I think what you've prompted a couple good ideas here. One is, I think in addition to a little bit of capital, catalytic capital in ideas, and often they're Indian generated, I also think there's a huge opportunity with the overseas Indian community. The number I'm quoted is 3 million, but I think you and I both agree it's much bigger than that. And I don't think either governments are as strategic as they could be. There have been a number of pilot attempts to leverage that expertise. There's a lot of informal connections going on all the time, which you and I are very cognizant of, but others may not be. But there may be ways, and there should be ways in which governments can accelerate that or make that easier. And so the money, a little bit of catalytic money, the knowledge, and some of these implicit networks that the overseas Indian community, I think, is also another leverage point for us. The other thing is, I think even though there are oftentimes, as you would agree, there's too much democracy in India, I do think that there are certain challenges in the world, whether it's Sri Lanka or parts of Africa, where having Indian actors help with, say, elections monitoring or parts of sort of the democracy and governance conversation is very critical. And I do think there are models by which we can provide, the United States can provide some know-how and some catalytic funding, but also partner with Indian institutions and have and work through Indian institutions, not necessarily working through American institutions in these third countries. So I agree with you that we want to be careful. I do think there is an openness or an evolution of openness on that. And let me just add one more opportunity. The opportunity is on trade. India is still not a completely open economy. There are a number of challenges, and I'm sure on the Indian side there will be a number of things that they would say are they find challenging about the American economy. But if you look at the trade numbers, U.S. bilateral trade with India was $50 billion last year. That's compared to almost $400 billion with China and over $400 billion with Canada. So what that says to me is another huge opportunity, even without getting to a full bilateral free trade agreement, is the opportunity is on trade, that we should be thinking about, in addition to sort of development, we ought to be shifting from a developmental paradigm, and you're describing various ways we can do that through know-how and catalytic funding and smaller dollars, but also to be preparing the terrain for a much bigger trade relationship. That's and right. The thing that for our viewers to watch is, does India and the United Kingdom get a free trade agreement on services? I think this is something a little bit going to be a canary in the coal mine over the next several years here, as to whether or not the United Kingdom, not the United States, is able to get an agreement on services, because I think that'll open up a huge opportunity with other developed nations, including the United States. And then I know there have been some informal discussions on what's called bilateral investment treaties, which is sort of a halfway house to free trade agreements and is one of the chapters in a much larger free trade agreement. Yeah, and I'm cognizant of the time.
I just want to respond to a couple of points which you made, and then
yes.
You see, I think the idea of diaspora links and international migration is a great sort of platform on which to build relations. And the point I want to add there is that we should not be focusing solely on government-based foreign policy, because civil societies and democratic societies are also capable of being foreign policy actors on their own. So as we go forward, we'll probably see, and I'm sure we're bound to see civil society groups, NGOs and so forth, increasingly playing a role in forging this relationship. On trade, a lot of it is got to do with internal domestic politics of India, right? Those of us who argue that second-generation reforms in India have been waiting for the last 10 years and nothing has moved, will sort of agree instinctively with the fact that Chinese trade is a lot ahead of India, because they started a lot earlier, maybe a decade or so earlier, but also because the Indian government in the last 10 years has been a laggard in trying to reform its own economic situation. For example, labor reforms has been waiting, because of which manufacturing jobs are not taking off in India as they ought to. Therefore, there is a focus on services. And services, therefore, being an international sort of an issue, leads India to want to open up the services markets in the rest of the world. But the moment the labor reforms, I saw the Prime Minister of India making noises about it again this morning, or it was last night, I guess. But it's about 5 more years before I see labor reforms moving. But when they do, the opportunities would sort of become symmetrical once again, because U.S. and Western companies who want to invest in manufacturing outside China, outside East Asia, would then be interested in investing in India. And then the services business would go both ways. So I think we're looking at a period of about 3 to 5 years where there would be some amount of tough negotiations in terms of free trade agreements and so forth. But if you look at a 5 to 10 year time frame, you would see a lot more of agreements happening, because that's when both the doors open on both sides.
Nitin, let's do this again. This was fantastic. Thanks for making the time to have me on, and I look forward to doing this again soon, and we can check in on trade progress. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Dan, and thanks to the good folks at the Blogging Heads for making this possible.
Thank you. Agreed. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.